Greetings to the members of the Billings Chamber of Commerce. I'm Dr. Nika White, the principal consultant of a management consulting firm under my brand name, headquartered in Greenville, South Carolina, but with service to organizations of all types, industries, and sizes across the country, including many with a global presence. Our consultancy is based on the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion with leadership and business. I'm honored for this invitation to help complement the Billings Chamber of Commerce 2020 Annual Meeting. I wish to thank Mr. John Brewer for the generous invitation. As I think back on our initial exchange concerning today's event, I immediately took notice of what was contained in Mr. Brewer's signature line of his email, which were these powerful words: "We stand with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American business community in committing to create equality of opportunity for all Americans." I want to read that again. "We stand with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American business community in committing to create equality of opportunity for all Americans. It is known that communities of color have been disproportionately impacted by the global pandemic. It is known that minority-owned businesses fail at a much higher percentage rate than white-owned businesses. It is known that the vibrancy of a community is determined by full opportunity for prosperity for not just some, but for all. It is also known that a rising tide lifts all boats." So it is in this vein that I'd like to share with you today on the topic of equity and inclusion, a business imperative. To address this topic, I'd like to come at it from the angle of Bryan Stevenson. For those of you who may not be familiar with Bryan Stevenson, Mr. Stevenson is a widely acclaimed public interest lawyer who has dedicated his career to helping the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. He is an American lawyer, social justice activist, founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, and a clinical professor at New York University School of Law. In his book, Just Mercy, Stevenson states 4 things we must do to solve for inequality. Those 4 things are: 1, get closer to the problem. 2, change the narrative. 3, be willing to be uncomfortable. And 4, maintain hope. I wish to help you get closer to the problem that I believe yields the biggest opportunity for Billings Chamber, which includes each of you as stakeholders. So we're going to talk about this notion of getting closer to the problem. When you're not close to the problem, there's greater propensity to dismiss the problem because it is perceived to not have a direct impact on you. Getting closer to the problem requires us to consider issues of inequities as humanity issues, rather than seeing them as issues assigned to a specific population of people, thereby requiring that they solve for the problem themselves. First, before we get too deep into this topic, we need to level set and define the problem which we are referring, which is systemic inequities that prohibit many from the opportunity of full prosperity. Language is so very important. So let's take a moment to dispel the notion that equality and equity are one and the same, because they are not. While they are interconnected, there is significance in the distinction. Equality is giving everyone the same thing with the expectation that this approach will yield success for all. Equity, however, recognizes that people have different starting points, and in that regard, their needs may vary from person to person. And it's necessary to solve for that by giving everyone what they need in order to be successful, and realizing that it may look different from one person to the next. Getting closer to the problem also allows us to realize that we must solve for inequities in processes, systems, and organizational structures, and not with a surface approach. Based on national data for African Americans and whites, we see consistent inequity in healthcare, education, law enforcement, child welfare, and finance, just to name a few. For example, according to data from federal agencies, African Americans are 2.3 times more likely to experience infant death. African Americans are 1 times more likely to die of diabetes. African Americans are 1.5 times more likely to be below proficient in reading in the 4th grade level. African Americans are 3.7 times more likely to be suspended in K through 12. African Americans are 2.7 times more likely to be searched on a traffic stop. African Americans are 7.0 times more likely to be incarcerated as adults. African Americans are 1.8 times more likely to be identified as victims by the child welfare system. African Americans are 2.1 times more likely to be in foster care. African American business owners are 5.2 times more likely to be denied a loan. And then African American business owners are 1.7 times less likely to own a home. I impress upon you again that we cannot be surface about the work of inclusion, but rather we must get proximate to the issues and problems, and that begins first acknowledging the problem. The lack of inclusion yields a false sense of belonging, and I want you to hear this next point. No one can show up at their best in any environment if they're always questioning whether or not they belong. Do I belong here? Am I valued? Am I accepted? Do I have full opportunity for success? If people are questioning whether or not they belong, they are not showing up at their best. So while all of those stats that I just shared provide a big picture overview, I want to attempt to put this in the context of the work that Billings Chamber can impact, and that's the work of economic inclusion. How many of you share my belief that if we can address the economics, we can address a lot of the other challenges communities experience that require systemic solutions, which are transformative in nature in order to create community prosperity? I think many of you would agree. Here's the harsh reality. Many women or minority-owned businesses are faced with obstacles like the lack of access to capital, the lack of skilled and educated employers in the communities where they operate, limited capacity to confidently take on sizable contracts, lack of exposure and general knowledge of opportunities that exist, so they don't know where to go and how to develop business. Minorities also often face lack of personal and professional networks that are so important to providing guidance. They face difficulty in making connections with other businesses in order to collaborate. And then there's the misconception that ethnic minority-owned businesses or women business owners do not have the same level of quality that they are offering as competing businesses. To sum it all up, these issues are real for these minority and women-owned businesses, and it makes the state of minority business very vulnerable. This vulnerability requires a level of intentionality to combat the aforementioned challenges that are true experiences for many minority and women business owners. So there has to be a purpose and a benefit of intentionality around practices that accelerate the growth of minority businesses. So you may ask yourself, what exactly are those benefits? Minority businesses in America account for $1 trillion in gross receipts and support almost 6 million jobs. That is a significant source of economic growth in America. And yet, the average minority-owned firm is still much smaller and has lower payroll than any other business, and quite frankly, has a lower chance of success. These issues are real for those members of the community, and in order to get to the crux of the matter, we must exercise intentionality in addressing the barriers that impede minority business growth. So number one, get closer to the problem. Now, this brings us to point number two, which is to change the narrative. If you have a lake in front of your house and one fish is floating belly up dead, it makes sense to analyze the fish, right? But if you come out to that same lake and half the fish are floating belly up dead, this time you've got to analyze the lake. Imagine that the lake is the education system, the justice system, financial system. This time we would ask, might the system itself be causing such consistent, unacceptable outcomes for people? If so, how exactly? Now, picture 5 lakes around your house, and in each and every lake, half of the fish are floating belly up dead. What is it time to do now? We say it's time to analyze the groundwater. How did the water in all these lakes end up with the same contamination? On the surface, the lakes don't appear to be connected, but it's possible and even likely that they are. In fact, over 95% of the fresh water on the planet is not above ground where we can see it. It is below the surface in the groundwater. The Racial Equity Institute uses the groundwater metaphor to help level set understanding of the reality that we live in a racially structured society and that is what causes racial inequity. The metaphor is based on 3 observations. 1, racial inequity looks the same across systems. 2, socioeconomic difference does not explain the racial inequity. And 3, inequities are caused by systems, regardless of people's culture or behavior. Embracing these truths forces leaders to confront the reality that all our systems and institutions and outcomes emanate from the racial hierarchy of which the United States was built. In other words, we have a groundwater problem, and we need groundwater solutions. What looks like resistance is often a lack of clarity, so educating ourselves on the root causes, the groundwater causes of systemic issues, is a business imperative. How does this relate to changing the narrative, you may ask? It forces us to consider the groundwater approach as we address equality and equity for all. Changing the narrative requires self-education. This means the more educated you are, the more knowledgeable you are to help identify solutions, because you understand the root cause. We can't be surface with our approach to this complex systemic issue. Understand history and current context of race is very useful. It helps us to get clear about goals, actions, and even performance measures. Changing the narrative also requires leadership because it necessitates that we operate with the lens of equity and inclusion. This entails recognizing the need to upskill the workforce around racism, bias, equity, and inclusion. So number 1 was get closer to the problem, which took us to number 2, requiring that we change the narrative. Number 3 amplifies that we must be willing to be uncomfortable. So I'm asking you to choose courage over comfort. Addressing racial equity will be a messy and deeply uncomfortable situation at times. Organizations that focus on developing the skills required to have difficult conversations, listen to difficult perspectives, and acknowledge mistakes will be more successful in this work. Developing leadership for racial equity looks different than traditional leadership development, which is why so many are focused on this topic at this time. Change is uncomfortable, no doubt about it. This work of equity is not just about changing policies and practices, but changing individuals' behaviors so that people can make better decisions that lead to greater equity. Leaders are just role models, and they must operate with intention and conviction to continuously practice and learn the art of science and skills of inclusive leadership. Operationalizing racial equity requires a focus on changing hearts and minds, because what's going on in people's hearts and minds lead them to make choices or not. It is uncomfortable to own the impact of our actions or of actions we benefit from, but we must choose courage over comfort. And this work starts at the personal level. It's more comfortable to sit in silence, pretending to be in a neutral position versus acknowledging the realities. But when you are a leader, you really never get to sit one out. However, by taking risk, leaders of social change often change the game. When leaders who are not necessarily known as social activists leverage their platforms to exert their influence, they often have a huge impact on the way society responds to an issue. So choose courage over comfort. Don't work so quickly to allow the discomfort to pass you by. Let's not waste this crisis. Let's let it move us to action. And remember that activity does not equate to impact. Activity has start and end dates. What we're trying to solve for requires changing systems, policies, procedures, and culture. That's what leads to sustainable, transformative change. This brings me to the topic of allyship. The work of allyship can also be uncomfortable, but it's necessary. An ally is any individual involved in the promotion and advancement of an inclusive culture through positive and intentional action. If you're a true ally, you're not just someone who has the sentiment of believing that equality and justice and dignity and fairness and respect for all should be provided. An ally sacrifices something, which is why they're often also referred to as an accomplice. They take risk by using their voice, changing the status quo, challenging other things that are perceived to be norms. They use their source of power and privilege to ally for the marginalized. All of those actions can be uncomfortable, but most sacrifices are uncomfortable. As an ally, what you're really doing is acting for others in pursuit of helping to end whatever type of oppression that exists. As an ally or an accomplice, you are leveraging your power, your influence, and privilege to help someone else overcome some of the hurdles or barriers that exist because of their situation or oppression. So again, I say, choose courage over comfort. So number one, we were told to get closer to the problem, which took us to number two, requiring that we change the narrative. Number three, amplify the need for us to be willing to be uncomfortable and choose courage over comfort. And now we're at number four, which requires that we maintain hope. To quote Brian Stevenson again, credited for these 4 points based on his Just Mercy book, don't let anybody or anything make you hopeless. Hope is the enemy of injustice. Hope is what we get you to stand up when people tell you to sit down. Nothing helps to maintain hope better than seeing progress. Even slow progress is progress. So my advice is to show your work, align your words with action. Think back to grade school when the teacher would not give full credit if you didn't show your work. You remember that? Otherwise, the teacher was saying there's lack of proof that you really know it and believe it and can solve for it again. We need everyone to be called to action in a way that allows us all as humanity to emerge stronger from what we are experiencing and witnessing far too often than we should be. Some may say, I don't know what to do. This is such an enormous undertaking. My efforts alone won't count. We must believe that our actions will make some level of impact for someone. And if we all approach life in that manner, we will collectively make a difference. What if the real danger lies not in stepping outside your sphere of influence, but in missing the opportunity to use your hard-earned credibility for greater good, especially when controversies lie at the heart of diversity, equity, and inclusion? We need to consider how they impact the people around us and how we contribute through action or inaction. So when contemplating whether to take a stand and leverage your influence, remember, it's really about people. It's about humanity. If you feel like you're better off staying in your lane and social justice shouldn't be your thing, consider the employees and clients and other humans up and down the supply chain who could be positively impacted and activated by your confident expression of your beliefs. Leadership is not just about what we do day to day within the boundaries of our organization's specific mission. Why not? Because the people we work with exist beyond the confines of the office, the stadium, the hospital, the university, or wherever we work. To not address what's happening outside your door is a missed opportunity and breeds a false sense of security. If you sit out, then others will sit in, and you could find yourself on the wrong side of history. So we must maintain hope. When you are hopeful about the outcomes of the journey ahead, you continue to perform even when the results are slow to reveal themselves. You continue to do things with intention and purpose and intentionality, which has a certain look and feel about it. It's not just busy work, but it's strategic work. It's something that is done with intention or purpose because you believe in the end result. In order to fully leverage intentionality, one must believe that the purpose can be fulfilled and that there is benefit for that in which you're trying to accomplish. So believing there is purpose and a benefit is the prerequisite for exercising intentionality and maintaining hope. One of the best ways to maintain and instill hope is to renew our commitment to economic inclusion. To the community individuals in the audience, the concerned citizens who are seeking to, in any small way, be a part of the solution to foster economic inclusion, you are encouraged to make an investment as well. Support minority and women-owned businesses. Refer them if you've had a good experience. And if you didn't, be bold and responsible enough to share that feedback respectfully. If they're missing the mark, they need to know. If you don't share, then you are perpetuating the problem. Be thoughtful about your own spending habits. Where you can, be proactive in seeking out a woman-owned or minority-owned business. Many markets have minority directories to help communities know who the minority suppliers are. Leverage your chamber as a resource. Corporate community. Being intentional requires being innovative, which requires work and sweat equity. If you plan and expect something to be successful, it will be successful because either you have reached the desired outcome or you have learned something of value to improve upon your strategy next time. Be careful not to get caught up in the "we tried that before and it didn't work" syndrome. That's the easy way out. And there's not an easy button for the work of economic inclusion. We need greater influence to gain traction and work around economic inclusion. And I'm a firm believer that in order to gain influence, we must demonstrate that economic inclusion adds value. Knowledge is powerful, and I have been fortunate enough to be exposed to enough knowledge to appreciate the impact economics has on so many other important social, community, and societal issues. We cannot afford to ignore key sectors of the business community, especially when considering the vast changes in the demographics upon us, where we are moving to a point where America will not have racial majority. We need to salute women and minority-owned businesses and keep telling the story of the significance of economic inclusion and why it matters. I'm asking you to refocus the conversation. Don't just tell women and minority-owned businesses you're proud of them and then pass up every opportunity to support them. Really support them. Refocus the conversation to make sure that people know that women and minority-owned businesses are effective engines for wealth creation and job creation. We must thank those business owners for being bold, leaders, confident, courageous, and directed. Thank them for what they're doing, because only a small percentage would ever attempt it. People who choose to be bold are inspiring, not just because they get big things accomplished, but because they also instigate growth, progress, and movement for themselves and others around them. The ripple effect of work of women and minority-owned businesses must be celebrated because it is important, it's significant. Children are watching, young people are taking notice and believing they can achieve the same. Refocus the conversation to make sure that people know that communities that are intentional in creating opportunities for all members of the business community are more cohesively and they're more vibrant and they're safe and they're healthy cities. This in turn builds cities that are attractive to individuals and businesses involved in the creation of new ideas, products, and services. And it builds a more inclusive business community, which attracts talent and corporations to the area. So you see, the results are far-reaching than just one successful business. And this is why we must never get weary in telling the story of the importance of economic inclusion. We must refocus the conversation, communicate on this topic, and communicate on it often. So as I close, I want to remind you to get closer to the problem, change the narrative, be willing to be uncomfortable, and always remember to maintain hope. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the 2020 annual meeting.